Hey folks, today we're going to try something maybe a little bit different. I've done an interview with Dr. Novak. He's the pioneer for anoxic filtration, a subject that's been highly requested on my channel and was sort of the subject of this aquarium redo. He really has a lot to say on the subject. The video is a bit long, but there's not a lot to see. So think of it more as sort of a podcast style. You can watch it, of course, or you can throw in some headphones and do your water changes. It's really fascinating, and I can't wait to share it with all of you. It's all coming up right after this. Hey YouTube, this is Pecktec, and I've got a special guest today. It's Dr. Novak. Tell me about yourself, Dr. Novak. You invented the anoxic filtration system, is that correct?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. I was doing some government work to help clean water, and in the interim, I came up with the anoxic filtration system, and that then led to going on to the pond hobby to help pond hobbyists.
So was it more like sewage treatment or that sort of thing when it initially began, or was it some other kind of filtration?
No, this was because in the hobby, in the early years of the hobby, back in the 80s, a lot of people couldn't keep their fish for very long, koi, and koi are very expensive, as you know, extremely expensive. And it was a shame to have these people lose their fish. But in the interim, people would sell filters to people, and then they'd wind up getting themselves into trouble. And the people would come back and say, "Oh, you need a bigger filter," and they would just be charging more and more money. And a lot of the stuff that people were doing was incorrect, selling them chemicals, things like that I was testing out that didn't work. A lot of snake oil and stuff were in this hobby. And
still is.
Yes, unfortunately, it still is. And so I just decided to help people out because if you know, with koi ponds, the filtration systems can get extremely expensive. I have it in my book and everything else. It's not unusual that you can have a $250,000 koi pond, and $50,000 of that could be the filtration. And with this filtration system, it's inexpensive, it's cheap, it works, and it will last you a lifetime. And you never have to keep upgrading.
So how many different materials did you try before you arrived at like baked clay? Or the cat litter, basically.
It was pretty fast because that was one of the first materials I used off of what is known, like laterite, and the baked clay is basically like laterite because of the crystalline structure it has. And it attracts ions. And what a lot of people do not know is water, even in your fish tank, is electrically charged. And they don't know that. And though you can put your hand in it, you're not getting shocked. That was something that when I tested other things, it could be pea gravel and gypsum and other things that were out there. They just didn't work the same way as the kitty litter did with the laterite. The laterite was basically added because of iron. And you got to remember, back then, over 30 years ago, people didn't know a lot about iron. And a lot of people don't know that iron helps the growth of bacteria. And they use quite a lot of iron in the initial stages of the cells reproducing. So this is something that I found out helped. It's not that something that is needed in the future as much, but since plants need the iron, it just was beneficial to use the laterite as a catalyst, for the iron. And the laterite is the same way as kitty litter. It basically attracts ions out of the water. So the kitty litter, even though it looks very compact, almost like you would say sand or mud, it has a different structure and it tracks, as we all know, that's why you use it in cat boxes, ammonia. And so I figured if it can attract that, and since koi and goldfish do not mind clay in their systems, how would that work? And it worked very well compared to anything else that I tried. But I didn't try a lot, but I did try maybe about 10 different substrates or 10 different medias to try. And a lot of them just failed. A lot of them you think will work, makes logical sense that they would work, but they just didn't work the same way as plain old ordinary kitty litter did.
I've actually been having trouble finding specifically kitty litter that's sold as baked clay. Now,
Right. A lot of
I
people
think I ran into the same thing you did in one of your later videos where my cat litter's like a little bit more granular than I expected.
Right. Some people are switching over to, which have contacted me, to oil dry, or you can go to a Tractor Supply house and they sell things like that, where
Oh,
it's the same thing. It's
okay.
basically oil dry that you put on the bottom of your garages when you have an oil spill. So it's basically the same thing as kitty litter. And they're not going to bother putting perfumes in it or anything else. It's
Right.
not meant for a person.
Yeah, because it's
Purpose.
just an industrial waste remover,
Right.
basically.
Right. It's clay, basically, is all it was. And it worked very well, better than I thought. And then, of course, I got in some other people to start doing research with on the whole thing. And we found out that it worked better than we even thought. And it was a very powerful system, the Anoxic filtration system. And what didn't start out to be the Anoxic filtration system, but the problem is I named it other names. And then when I took those names out to the public, they were too hard to pronounce. So that's how I really came up with the Anoxic filtration system, because then people could pronounce it, and really that's how it came up with the Anoxic filtration system. It was just a lot easier for people to say it than
Right.
some of the names I gave it.
And I noticed the other sort of filter, and it works in the same principles. It basically is the same principle. Is the BCB basket, or is that
Right. So biocenosis clarification baskets. Now, I had to name it that, and I had to patent that and everything, that name, because, it never existed until I came up with it. Biocenosis clarification baskets. And that's exactly what they are, the BCBs. And instead of saying the big long name, you just call it a BCB. Basically,
right?
that was the basket that held the kitty litter. And when I first started this, believe it or not, the baskets I used came from Australia, because ponding was still in its infancy, I would say, here in America. People had ponds, but not as prevalent as it did when the 90s came along. And then it really started booming, because it was hard to get things. In fact, laterite I had to get from Dupla, because that was hard to get. So I had to go to Germany to get that. So as these products became more readily available to people, then everybody could use it. But yeah, it wasn't very easy for me to get baskets from Australia. Dupla was the one who had to give me the laterite that I used, because nobody sold it in the United States, those products. That's why I really didn't come out with it for the hobbyists, because the products were too hard to get. Of course, as time went on, the products became more readily available and easier to get for everybody, and it didn't become a big thing anymore.
It probably helped that planted tanks started becoming a thing. Now I know that
Right.
they've done planted tanks since the '70s, but I think back then they were just like the Whistling method or something, basically the
Right.
dirted tanks and stuff like that.
Right, but it was, if you remember, uh, back in the 70s, right, when people made tanks, um, still the undergravel filter was used.
Hmm.
And then manufacturers started changing it because if you go earlier, like back in the 50s and 60s, undergravel filters had little bitty lift tubes, maybe a half-inch diameter, if you remember. They just used a bubbler where you just bubble one bubble at a time. They were very slow-moving undergravel filters. And then manufacturers start changing that to, with 1-inch lift tubes. They went all the way to the top of the surface. Air stones started being used, and they were moving more and more water. And this is because of sewage treatment plants. Well, what they had done is ruin the undergravel filter. And it became what people said was a mechanical filter.
Right.
And that came out with gravel vacs. So it wasn't a problem. I don't know how people complained about it so much, but they did. I never had a problem using the undergravel filters. But when I did my research, like just making a slow moving plenum, I went back to the way things were back in the 50s and 60s, where water would move very slowly through the substrate, just like in a natural system. And they had it right all along. Maybe it was because of they wanted to become more popular. They speeded up the amount of water going through the undergravel filter.
There's
And
always that perception that more is better. So
right, exactly. And that's where your 1-inch lift tubes. Then, of course, power heads came into play. And then everybody complained. I remember they complained about they got real dirty. So when I did experiment in class that we took a 55-gallon tank and we did a reverse undergravel filter, because undergravel filters usually pull water through the gravel. Well, I did a reverse there where the water went down the lift tubes and then went up through the gravel through the bottom, right? So we did 600 gallons an hour per side of a 55-gallon tank. So on one side is 24 inches, the other side is 24 inches, because they're 48 inches long. We were pumping 600 gallons an hour in reverse through each filter plate. And then after 365 days, we were going to test which one was dirty, which substrate was dirty, because the water that was being pumped through the undergravel filter in reverse was being cleaned first. And we found out that both gravel systems, because we had 255s, were just as dirty as the other one. So it didn't matter if you pump water going from the top down or from the bottom up. The system still got as dirty. And it didn't matter how much water you pump through, it's still going to get as dirty. Water is the substrate, and everything that's in the dirt and everything is going to be attracted to the substrate. So then I start thinking, wait a second, it doesn't matter how fast you're pumping the water, it's still going to get dirty. But you have gravel vacs now, right?
right.
And of course, if the substrate or what goes in there, food, waste, if it could be broken down, it turns into mum, which is inert, right?
Right.
So that's when I went back to slow moving, almost like a plenum. Now, a plenum would be your first step. Let's say if you can't connect it to a canister filter, like I showed one of my videos, or if you don't want a bubbler, don't want the noise. So a plenum is the first thing I would do if you're setting up a tank, by getting the filter plates and putting at least the substrate on top of that, because you have to move water through the substrate. It doesn't matter whether you have plants or don't have plants. Water has to move in and out of the substrate. If you don't do that, and I don't know how this came about, where people start throwing their substrate directly on the bottom of tanks, which we did in the 70s, like sand and stuff, what we noticed was the blackening of the gravel. And if that happens, then you're going to get hydrogen sulfide and stuff like that, or you're going to get
it's anaerobic conditions, right?
Right. But people didn't understand that the bacteria that are living there are actually taking nitrates, because people used to say under those conditions, right, it will eat up your nitrates. What they didn't understand is that bacteria takes nitrates and breaks it down to nitrites and back into ammonia, and that is released back into the system. So what you're doing is trying to get rid of ammonia, but you have a bacteria now that's starting to make ammonia.
So it's also generating ammonia. That's odd.
Right. And people thought that anaerobic conditions got rid of nitrates, but all they did was make another problem, a more deadlier problem. Let's put it that way, ammonia. And that is what was happening when you put your substrate on the bottom of an aquarium. So the Germans came up with heating cables. But I tried the heating cables too, and a lot of people did. And what happened is the heating cables would fail. Like mine failed within a year. And plus, they don't work in the summer. So if you live in Florida, if you live in even Illinois, like you live in Chicagoland, in the summer, the heating cables never came on. So once again, the substrate would start going anaerobic. And plants cannot live in anaerobic conditions. They got to live in aerobic conditions. So when I start testing the bacteria and stuff like that in such a slow-moving undergravel filter, I found out that you had anoxic conditions. Well, people got scared because when you start talking about heterotrophic facultative anaerobic bacteria, it's a long name for a bacteria, people got scared and said, I don't want anything anaerobic in my aquarium. Yeah. And then you have to explain to them that you have this bacteria in your mouth and you're alive. Okay, so it's nothing to be scared of. Don't be scared. It only carries the name anaerobic, why scientists gave it, because it's dimorphic, meaning it can live in an aerobic or anaerobic situation. That's why a Harvard chemist, when he looked at my work, was quite surprised, because he said, even if you lost electricity, even for a week or two, your system doesn't die like other people's system. I said, yeah, how did you know that? And his wife spoke up and said, well, he's a Harvard chemist. You know, he graduated from Harvard. And well, it doesn't take a Harvard chemist, because I had other chemists working with me and stuff like that to figure that out, that these low oxygen conditions are very good for plants, excellent for plants, plus making a slow moving plenum brought the nutrients to the roots, but very slowly. So when we had undergravel filters, the water was moving so fast, the plants wouldn't grow good, if you remember back then. So they were really like, oh, they're not for planet tanks. You can't have it, because we had ruined a great idea, and now it turned sour on people. So you could see where people would start saying, oh, undergravel filters or plenums, they're no good. But then the plenum came out from a professor in France, and it was used, and it's got to be made a special way. But then they found out that even an undergravel filter that has nothing even running through it will become a plenum. But I found out just if you move water and displace water very slowly in that system, it works even better yet than what was.
Oh, then just a plenum with no movement.
Well, yeah, because I made a plenum connected to my canister filter, but basically water takes the path of least resistance. Therefore, most of the water went into the canister filter, and very little was sucked through the plenum. You know, I had that tank going for 20 years like that. 20 years. Never had to really break it down or anything. And it went just fine. And in fact, it's in my video where you saw angelfish spawning. I had corridors spawning in it. And that was a tank that was never broken down, because that was something I noticed, that if you make a system like that, a slow moving plenum, that tank can be set up for 10, 20 years before you would ever have to break it down. Now, I understand that when people threw their gravel on the bottom of an aquarium, the problem is they kept changing your tanks like once a year. And that's okay if you're going to mess everything up and change it every year. But see, I don't like doing that. I set up a tank and it's set up for years and years and years. So that's why I went with the slow moving plenum. And it worked with goldfish, which are very heavy body. All you have to do is put a screen and then add another, half inch or inch of substrate on top of that so the goldfish can dig around. And then they wouldn't touch the bottom part because the screen was there, and it was good for cichlids and things like that. Then it was a guy named Luke about 2 years ago who said, can we use this anoxic filtration system instead of in a sump? Can we use it in a canister filter? And he did it. He even made a video on it. And that's why I did my BCB in a canister filter.
Oh, and what a canister you chose.
Yeah, the ADA canister filter. And normally I use Eheims, okay? But all my Eheims, I'm going to be honest with you, are cracked or broken.
Oh, yeah. It's that plastic.
I think I mentioned that, not that I'm an abuser of my equipment because, these are expensive filters. Let's face fact. Eheims are expensive. And I've used Eheims for years and years and years, but all the ones I had were either cracked and I glued them and the glue came apart. And I thought, I'm tired of this. That's why I got the ADA. Very expensive, but I knew it's not going to crack or go out on me. That's why I did the video. And I made the BCB basket to fit in there, kind of copying what Luke had done 2 years ago when he did his BCB basket, or how he did it. I changed it, though. I used a little more engineering to it. And I made it so water takes the path of least resistance and goes underneath it and around it. And see, that was another thing I found out. The anoxic filtration system is the only filtration system that we know of that doesn't clog, because water is not being forced through the substrate or through the filter media. So therefore it doesn't clog. So in other words, once you make one of these baskets, the BCB basket, it should be around for 20 or 30 years and you'll never have to do a thing to it. It will last that long. I've had baskets in my ponds over 30 years old, never had to touch them. And
so let me interrupt you for a second. So is the reason that never clogs because those electrically charged ions are being drawn into it versus water being forced through it like you traditionally think of a filter? Is that the way it works?
Right. Correct. Because when you move water through a substrate, okay, you have a few problems. You have water shearing, which the bacteria now have to go up against, and they make a polymeric adhesive. So let's say you take a piece of sintered glass or a piece of foam or another material that we use in this hobby.
Right.
Porcelain.
Floss
Okay. What happens is the bacteria can go in the crevices, we found out, and it builds this adhesive because it doesn't want to, these are living and dying cells is all it is. And that clogs it up. And we found that out with the sintered glass material that came from Germany. The inside, yes, it had a surface area, but the inside actually clogged up. That's why a lot of manufacturers will tell you to replace the material after a year or two, because they know it clogs up. They're not dumb. You want to open it up, you either got to use bleach or muriatic acid to go in there and flush out and kill and eat up the bacteria. And then you will open up all the pores again to reuse it, as the manufacturer has said. So manufacturers knew this. Don't think manufacturers are dumb. They know exactly what they're doing. They hire people like me to let them know what to do and how to do it. And so they can still make money when they sell you these products. And we all know that with sponges. Yeah, you have to wring them out, look at all the dirt and things like that. That's how if you remember, people started cleaning stuff in buckets of aquarium water. You couldn't put them over the sink anymore, and because the chlorine would kill them. Chlorine is a sterilizer, right?
You're
And that
trying
would
to
kill all
save the bacteria.
Right. Well, Anoxic filter, you don't have to clean. You just pull it out, set it off to the side, and clean your filter and clean it real good, sterilize everything in case you have any parasites or anything, and then put the filter back in there, and you're good to go. You never lose your bacteria. Another thing we found out is when the power goes out, let's say you're using a canister filter. Okay, I'll give you this. Your power goes out. Oh no, power's out, right? You start getting scared after the hours start ticking away, right? I mean, this happens to everybody, right? We all go through this. Okay, if your electric's out for a day or two or three, that's it. And I even had people from the United Kingdom say, oh, I did my filter and I was using it, an Anoxic filter, and for my daughter or whatever, forgot to plug everything back in and get started. And he said, boy, I thought that's it. The filter's gone. He said, but it didn't. Once I fired it back up, I did some water changes and everything went back to normal. He says, I'm so happy I had it. Well, see, what happens exactly is if your power goes out and you're using a BCB, the bacteria doesn't die. It just reverts to using another source, a food source, an oxygen source. That's why it's dimorphic. That's why they say it's anaerobic. It will steal its oxygen from other means to make oxygen, okay? And that's why it keeps living. So when you have it in a pond and the wintertime is over, that bacteria doesn't die in the wintertime like our nitrosomatis does and things like this.
Right.
It keeps working all during the winter because it's not, cold doesn't affect it because this bacteria is all over the world. So cold doesn't affect it. It may slow down. It may die because of the food source isn't there. Okay, you understand? But as long as the food source is there, it's going to keep living. So if your power goes out, you don't lose your canister filter. You don't have to worry about firing it back up. Just fire it back up and it'll be perfectly fine. It'll keep doing the work it was supposed to do. Because once it starts seeing a food source, then it'll start taking in the ions once again and using them. And ammonia is one of the ions that will go inside the basket and it'll be used as a food source. That's why when people have told me, oh, I forgot to turn on my filter, my daughter forgot to do it, and yet when I fired up the filter, everything went back to normal, is because it just changed, the bacteria just changed from an aerobic situation to an anaerobic situation back to an aerobic situation. And it's low oxygen. They live in low oxygen. That's about 2 parts per million to 0.5 parts per million is the low oxygen they live in, the best. Okay. By that time, the bacteria that we use from sewage treatment facilities cannot live. It's not enough oxygen for them to then start doing the process of breaking down ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates. But we found out that this bacteria would use nitrates, and we found out phosphates, and this was because of Dr. Franco in Italy found out that it also was using the phosphates that were being produced. So it was using nitrates and phosphates, two problems that cause all kinds of cyanobacteria and hair algae and string algae and all kinds of algae problems. Because in ponds, as we all know, ponds get direct sunlight. And if you don't want them to turn green, you better have a filtration system that can handle it. Otherwise, they would be green, because there's a lot of waste from koi. You know, these are big animals. They produce a lot of waste compared to a fish tank.
Yeah.
And these are expensive fish, so you can't fool around with them. But everybody who did trust me and use the Anoxic filtration system for their pond were very happy. There was less maintenance they had to do. It worked right after, in March, when the season starts changing, once I fired up that filter in March, and it's still cold up north, once the temperature would even reach 50 degrees, most filters aren't running still. Anoxic filters are already running, and I was already feeding my fish. I was already feeding them. I'd feed them like every 3 days. People couldn't even feed their fish yet my fish were being fed. And this is a very critical time for koi and goldfish because they're coming out of that dormancy, and they need food. And you need
don't
to
they
start
they produce eggs during that dormant period, right?
right. And you can start feeding them worms and stuff like that. And they start needing food. And if they get food, they're going to start making waste. And koi are very efficient, carp are very efficient at expelling ammonia. Very efficient fish at doing that. And then people would start getting ammonia spikes. So then they'd have to re-inoculate their whole filtration systems. They'd have to clean them out. Anoxic filter, all I did was once it fired up and the weather got nice enough, I just went out there, emptied it, cleaned out any dirt or anything that was in it, and just refill it. That was it.
All right.
I'm done. I didn't have to worry about re-inoculating anything.
I have a couple of questions sort of specific to my scenario and just a little bit of background. Like I started with aquariums I had them as a child and I remember under gravel filters and stuff like that.
Right.
And then when I came back to it, like that's all there was when I was in the 70s. And when I got into it more recently and where I'm at now was probably about 15 years ago. And I got really attracted to planted tanks. And the first thing they told me with a planted tank is don't use an under gravel filter. So I immediately just considered them old and never even really thought about it until this year when I saw your videos about adding the plenums and stuff. So, but I have a lot of tanks like the one you see here, or you don't see it because I don't have video on my Zoom, but my little, I've got a lot of aquariums that don't have anything in them. And some of them do okay. And some of them just never do. Like the 20-gallon, the video that I made which was inspired by your work, where I added a plenum to my 20-gallon and stuff. That tank, no matter what I did, no matter how I set it up, it would be covered with hair algae, and I would clean it. I got to where I was doing my bi-weekly water changes. I was changing water all the time. I was cleaning it all the time. When you do your hobby in public, like we do on YouTube, it's real important, to not have it look trashy. So I was a real struggle to try and make it look right. Since I've added the plenum, and I'm not sure I did it 100% correctly, but since I added the plenum, I've had zero problems. Like I saw a little bit of blackbeard algae kind of crop up, and I think it might have been there already, but then the fish kind of ate it, and then it was gone. The water's
my tank's the same way. Once I started that BCB, boy, that algae didn't last long at all because it just literally starves it right out. And you're right. I know what you mean. I hear this story, but the story gets worse. You're lucky you live in the United States. People that live in Africa and in other parts of the world, they don't have the luxury of changing water like we can. We could change water like it's nothing, right? We don't even think twice about it. Other countries, they were asking me, hey, I can't change water like that. I'm lucky if I could change water once a month. I can't be changing water every week in my pond or in my tank.
Well, even California, where they, I guess, basically get all their water from another state.
Right.
It's
Arizona.
It's rare, to be able to change water like they do.
Right. And some people, they think you should be doing these large water changes and everything, and you just can't. You can't. And what happens is that their tanks start getting fouled or messed up. And I noticed with these, like with this canister filter that I did, and with ponds, like ponds, I never did change my water except in spring. I would add, clean the filter and change the water, and in late fall. That's it. Because a lot of people, that's all they can change, maybe twice a year. And so you have to cater to them. Now, as much as the koi enthusiasts will turn around and say, well, that's wrong. That's, you got to cater to people. You can't get so arrogant that you think they need to listen to you. You need to listen to the hobbyist. The hobbyist dictates to you what you need to invent. It's not the other way around. You can't dictate to the hobbyist what to do. So you got to work around what they can do. If they can't do the water changes, but they're still going to keep fish, you can get arrogant about it and say, well, then you don't deserve to keep fish. But it doesn't work that way. They have every right to keep their animals, just like you do. That's one reason I came up with the Anoxic filter. They have a right, but they also have a right to let their fish live and grow and not have all the problems. So the Anoxic filter did that for people. It let them have an aquarium or a pond. They didn't have to do all the water changes. They could have the animals you want. And believe me when I say this, pond people are the worst people for overcrowding. And they are terrible. They overcrowd their ponds. It's like, you really need to get rid of some of your fish. And they can't. They won't. They won't listen to you. They'd rather buy a new piece of gear so they can keep all their fish than to sacrifice getting rid of their fish. That's just the way it is. You've got to work around the people. You got to work around people that have goldfish. You got to work around the people that have Oscars. You got to work around the people that only want to have a few little neons. So in my videos, I've been criticized because, look at your little tank. You have these discus in there and you have the angelfish. I said, you're missing the point. The point is I can have these because I'm using an Anoxic filter.
Your water's clean.
Right. And we proved that in school where we put a fish in a tube and ran clean water through the tube. And the fish grew to the point they couldn't even move anymore in the cylinder. But we kept running food and clean water through the tube. They grew and they couldn't even swim anymore. They were all crammed together like sardines. So that's proof that you can trick fish and they will grow as long as the conditions are right. Okay, they don't know. They don't have the brains like us humans. Right. They don't know. And if you can trick them, they will grow and be very happy. And I get a lot of people saying, oh, your tank's overcrowded. Well, you're missing the point. I'm trying to show you how powerful the filtration system is, okay? So it gives you a little leeway with your fish. So because I know a lot of people with like African cichlids really overcrowd their tanks. And I've seen them big time. I mean, I've seen sardine cans have more room than some African cichlid tanks. It's just horrible. So you have to work around the people. They're not going to change because you went to school and got a degree and they didn't. They're not going to change. Work around the people. That's what I did. I made a system that works around the people. It's forgiving to the people when they make mistakes. And when I did this with the ADA, and you can make it out of an E-Hine, I've even rest assured people, and I'll even tell you this, okay? I don't even know you, you don't know me. Right. But if you wanted to make if you went out and bought, I'm just telling you right this on the air, let's say you bought a canister filter, an E-Hine, like my ADA, you don't have to, and you did a basket just like I did. I guarantee it will work. And if it don't work, I'll send you a check for what you bought. It will work. That's how sure I know it will work.
Wow.
I will send you a check and you will have bought nothing. That's how sure I know that if you went out and bought yourself, let's say a 2217 E-Hine, you did follow my directions. I know if you put that on a tank, you're going to be amazed. You're going to say, no, I don't get my money back.
I
Because
don't think you can make a much more
no,
sure of yourself
because
statement than that.
I've seen it. I've even told people that if you use this filter in your pond, if it don't work, I'll pay for your stuff. Well, it worked. So I never had to shell out any money. It's like, wow, it worked. And I've had people claim when they went over people's homes who were using Anoxic filter for their ponds and stuff, claim that they were lying.
Hmm.
Really? Oh yeah, koi experts and oh, you're lying. You got another filtration system on this pond. There's no way your water is this clean and your fish are this healthy using that. It's no. Where is it? Where you hide it? And people would sit there and no, this is all I'm using. And they couldn't believe it. And it's the same way I'm trying to show the video, like with this aquarium. I'm also going to do another video. I'm going to show one. I'm going to put a tank on the lanai, maybe a big one, and once again, I'll be using another canister filter, making a BCB for that. And I can either use it with a substrate or without a substrate. And the good thing about it, think about this. If you had a tank without a substrate, you could pull it apart, put the basket off to the side, clean all your medium, throw away what you want, put it all back together again, and you can fire it back up, and you're not going to have a problem, even if you had no substrate, because the BCB will just take over where it left off. Just because you're going to set it off to the side to clean your canister for 15, 20 minutes, it's not going to hurt the BCB or the bacteria in there, because I know I've done it thousands and thousands of times. So in one way, if you could use this even for tanks that had no substrate or medium on the bottom, where they're bare bottom. But I can't say, will this work for every canister? All I know is the Eheim Classic or the ADA, the way they're designed, works because the water comes from the bottom and comes up. Okay, I know that's will work because this, as an engineer, that's going to work. Now all these canisters are being made with the inlet and outlets on top. How do you get the water to go from the bottom and come back up again? That I couldn't solve. But because of these Eheim Classics and the 88 filters are designed the old way, water must come in the bottom and go to the top. I was really surprised how well this is doing. It's doing great. And I got no nitrates at all.
Pretty quickly working.
Pretty quickly,
great
yeah.
Too.
And I think that's contribute also to the, don't forget the plenum I'm using.
Right.
That's been running for a while. So I'm going to contribute that to both are helping each other. In other words, they won't.
It seeded the bacteria out of that plenum and into the.
That's right. And that's why I showed in my video after 7 days, you look at the hoses, they're already growing bacteria in there. So there's no reason to baby cleaning a canister filter anymore if you have a BCB in it. Hang on the back filters could have been done the same way. I think if you remember, we used to use the Supreme, the Aqua Clear, the Aqua Masters, and the water would be pumped into a big, huge box in the back with a big pump on it, and the water had to be forced through it. You could have made that into an Anoxic filter also. But today's new filters, they're all cartridges. You put a cartridge in, pull a cartridge out. Basically, they're made for ease of doing mechanical filtration. That's what they're designed for.
Okay.
But somewhere along the line, if you watch some of these videos, they're trying to use these hang on the back filters and turn them into biological filters also. Well, I've never had to worry about biological filter because my tanks have always been able to maintain with the substrate any biological needs I needed. So I've never had to worry about that. But a lot of people make a big deal over it. Oh, you're going to have an ammonia spike. Well, if you're having an ammonia spike, you've got other problems with your aquarium than your hang on the tank filter. You've got other problems.
Sure.
Your tank is out of balance. You would agree to that. Your tank is out of balance then because your substrate, you have enough substrate in there. You should be able to maintain just about any kind of fish load except for maybe some gigantic Oscars or
right, the mega waste producers and stuff like that.
Right, something that's going to be eating live fish and causing quite a lot of waste. I can understand that. Maybe your substrate wouldn't be able to hold it. But once people start putting the substrate at the bottom of the aquarium, and they lost a lot of benefits that substrate gave them. And I understand perfectly why people use sand. It's cheap. Substrate that you buy at a pet store is very expensive. But then again, I was curious, like, but you're buying this very expensive substrate for these planted aquariums. There was one YouTuber, he said he spent $360 on substrate for his aquarium. It's like, wow.
If you go like going back to like a mono, and if you go for the full ADA package, I mean, I did all the supplements and they call it power sand, which is like porous rocks and stuff. In fact, I was wondering about that. I mean, obviously, Amano had great success with planted tanks and stuff, but I'm wondering, are those porous base layers, are they working as like sort of like a plenum? Is that why they're a little bit like, I've had great success with that particular one, but what I don't understand is like, well, maybe that success comes with a time limit. Like eventually,
exactly. You hit the nail right on. It has a time limit. Okay. It does have a time limit. Remember that. All planted tanks that are done that way have a time limit. And then you'll notice, like, it will become its precipice, where it's great, right? We all notice that. We have a time where, holy cow, this looks just like the Dutch aquariums, and this looks just like the Amano aquariums, and then all of a sudden something happens and everything starts changing and collapsing. You notice that in your tanks? All of a sudden, yes. What happened? What happened all of a sudden? It's because they wind up collapsing, because one thing you have to understand about substrate, everything has to keep moving in and out of it freely. Eventually, remember I gave the example of the aquarium glass. If you put it underneath the aquarium, you think you have a perfect scenario because you took it out of Mother Nature, but it would soon collapse on you. It would soon die on you because the biological, chemical pathways and biological pathways have been blocked off. It's exactly what happens. So eventually, you're going to have to throw the towel in and redo it. But a lot of these people have planted tanks. They seem to redo their tanks once a year anyhow. So that's the old thing like Aquascape does with their ponds. Every year, they throw stones in them to make the bacteria system, but every year they insist you clean it out and power wash it and get all that muck and everything out of there.
Right.
Those ponds are extremely dirty. Okay. So that's how they solve the problem. I even known people to carry a set of stones for their ponds, and then over by the garage, they carried a whole nother set of stones. So every year they would take those stones out, clean their pond, and put the new stones back in. So that's exactly what happens to aquariums. But with ponds, it happens within a year. They become eutrophic. They get 100 years of damage done to them in 1 year.
Right.
Our tanks are the same way. We start doing damage to them very shortly. And that's why I've tried it where I put the stones at the bottom of the aquarium, like on a flue bowl, 5 gallon or something like that. I never had good success. I always had algae problems, fish problems, just always had problems when I did that. It never quite worked for me. And I couldn't understand why people are doing it. It never worked for me. And I'm just being honest with you. It didn't. Maybe it worked for you or other people, but I could never get it to work quite right.
For me, it was maybe 1 out of every 4 tanks I would set up would be really successful. And
right.
I was.
You don't know why, right? You don't know why.
No. Well, no. I would try something different every time, and I had the luxury of recording everything I do so I could go back and reference it. But I've even tried the same thing a couple of times and then not got consistent results where in theory I should
Exactly.
have.
See, that's what you have to do. Now, when you do research, a lot of people say, oh, I set up some tanks and I did this. When you do research, like I did, let's say you set up 10 tanks, you do research, and then you find out what you want to find out. Then you have to set up those 10 tanks again, and then you have to set them up again. This takes years of doing until you get, because right away, if you hand any white paper to a scientist and said, here's my white paper, here's what I discovered about this, this, or this. And they're going to ask you, the first question is, what's the repeatability? Well, I don't know. Well, you only set up 10 tanks. We got to know repeatability. Well, you know, if your repeatability is only 40%, what good is it?
Right.
You know,
well, that's part of the scientific method is to prove that.
You have to prove it. That's why you have to keep, that's what takes so long with research that people don't understand. Repeatability. What is just like the new vaccine they're coming out, right? 90%. That's better than the flu vaccine, which is only 60%. They have to find this out. This is part of research. And the research I did, that's part of your research where you just can't set up a few tanks and say, oh, I did it this way and it works. Okay, do it again. And then after that, do it again. And then after that, do it again. And do it at least 10 to 20 times. And now let's see how it repeats. So you can let people know, is it 80%, 90%, 70% repeatability? What is the repeatability? Because that's what people are going to want to know. How much research did you put it in? You just can't set up one tank and say, oh, it failed, it's no good. Like you said.
Or it succeeded and it's perfect.
Right, like you said. You may set up 4 tanks, 1 out of 4 is good. So you're only going to get a 25% success rate. But that's not really that good if you think about it.
No.
If I set up 4 tanks and only 1 comes out, that's only a 25% success rate. And me, I've done the same thing as you. I've done the same thing. I put the gravel on the bottom or my substrate on the bottom, boom, doesn't work. I have to take it down within a year or whatever because I'm having all kinds of problems, whatever. But like I said, I've done it this way and I've went 10, 20 years without a problem. And you use a gravel vac maybe every 6 months, clean out your gravel, big deal. That's no big deal.
Right.
Keep going with it. You don't have to tear the aquarium down. So that's why I wanted to show people. I know some people are never going to believe it. That's okay. They don't believe it.
Sure.
And some people do believe it. In fact, there's a guy, Matthew Cooper over in the United Kingdom, who is actually going to start making the Anoxic filter for ponds and actually employ that with pond building for people. You know how pond builders, they go out and buy a filter and everything else, you know.
Sure.
He's actually now going to use stainless steel baskets for people and everything else. He's actually going to build ponds using the Anoxic filter for them. Instead of them going out and buying filters that you can't increase, and then they have to sell you a bigger filter. Oh, this happens all the time in ponding, believe me. To get you into ponding, they'll sell you a filter. Oh, here, they keep the price as low as possible. Then once you're involved in it, and you got all these fish, and you find out you have problems, then they come look at it and say, you know what you need? You need a bigger filter. Your filter's not capable. Well, what are you going to do? Now you have a filter you can't do nothing with, but now you have to buy this bigger and better filter.
Just keep buying it.
Right. So I would always tell people, build your Anoxic filter so big, and you can just add baskets to it.
Okay.
That's it.
This segues really good into another question I had. I'm about to do a basket project where I build some baskets. And I guess my big question is the size of the basket. How small can they be and still be effective? Like I've got, are you familiar with like the fluval spec aquariums?
Yeah.
They have those chambers in the back, and the spec and the flex and the Megaflex and stuff, they all have these like extra chambers. And I think they were originally designed in case you wanted to use them with salt water, you could put a skimmer in there. And it seems like a great place to jam one of these baskets in because the water's going to flow through there. I'm sorry?
Maybe a mesh bag.
Right.
But you have to make sure that the water will go around it and not try to be forced through it.
Right.
So that's the problem I had with mesh bags and everything, is you have to make something more solid. So in that chamber that you're thinking about, you're going to have to make something to let water flow on the sides and everything, and not push off to the side.
You can't take up the whole chamber where it had to be pushed through it. It's got to have a space all the way around it, so the water flows around it and then onto the pump.
Absolutely correct.
And so, but is there a size where it just becomes ineffective? Like, can you make a teeny tiny one for a small aquarium?
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know. The smallest I've ever made is a 4x4x4 basket.
Oh, okay.
I'm being honest with you. That's the smallest I've ever made. How small can you go before it becomes ineffective? I don't know. I know that I've had people make very large baskets. I've had very large ones. The problem is trying to pick something like that up. You know, they get pretty heavy once they get soaked with water. And other than that, how small you can go, that I don't know. See, I have a GoFundMe page, you know. This takes a lot more research. Mm-hmm. How small can you go? And, you know, research is expensive and time consuming. And, you know, people just don't want to put the time in or the money into research because it is expensive. You got to get all the tanks. You got to see how small you go. You got to keep the testing equipment. Testing equipment is expensive. And I see when I test something, I don't use the same test kits you use. I use very expensive test equipment.
Right.
You know, that costs money, a lot of money, thousands of dollars. So
and testing could be kind of tedious too.
Right. And
especially with little dropper kits and stuff. It takes
but hobbyists use the hobbyist test kit. They don't want to use like a Lamont or something like that because it's too expensive. Mm-hmm. I understand that's okay. But for professionals now, they come in, you know, they got a few $1,000s in test kits there, a Lamont or something. That's what they're going to use, like a DVM or something like that. That's what they're going to bring in. They're going to bring in the big boys to test everything. And like I said, some of those chemicals are poison. You know, you got to really watch how you're handling. So we use the hobbyist test kits, which are considerably cheaper.
Do they make like I know like the Hanna has the electronic one for ammonia, but do they do for nitrates too?
They have the ones where they're electronic, like Dr. Frankel showed, but that's expensive. You know, where you do the tube and put it inside there and it analyzes it through the analyzer. Dr. Frankel used it. You know, that stuff's expensive. That's a little more out of the realm of the hobbyist. Dr. Frankel did
unless you're colorblind and you have no choice.
Yeah, but of course, yes, they do. It's expensive. More money than probably what you would want to spend on a test kit. You'll probably just say, hey, I can go out and buy an API. You know, I don't need to go out and buy $300-400 test station like that. No, you don't. That's more professionals.
I've been getting frustrated trying to determine what the damn color is, especially because this set me off on a whole thing where I started going to each of my tanks and I'm measuring the nitrate load. Okay. And it's pretty low, I guess. I know from what you've said, optimal is 0, is what the goal should be, right? So mine are optimal. Like it goes, and on the test colors, you've got 0 and then 5. And I'm somewhere in between those. Like it's not orange and it's not perfectly yellow. So
that's where like a Lamont comes in, because they start even going lower than that. You know what I mean? Like, so you really getting down to the nitty gritty of really what is in your tank. Okay, so But for your purposes, you're doing great. With the test kits you're using, you don't need to know 0.5 of nitrate nitrogen. You don't need to go that low, 0.5. That's more for professionals. They need to know that information. You don't. So what you're doing is okay. Yeah, it goes to 5, right?
Right.
I think it goes to 5, 10. If you can get it below 5, you're good. You're doing real good. And as we saw when I did one of my videos on the other guy who did a video, he had a lot of plants, the substrate. He only had about 13 little fish in it. He still had nitrogen, nitrates, and phosphates going off the charts, where the one where he used CO2 didn't. That was a good video to watch, because people think, oh, plants are going to use up all my nitrates, and plants, you got to understand how plants work. And I have friends that are professors that teach, aquatic microbiology and everything.
Right.
And you got to understand that only during peak photosynthesis do they start using nitrates. So when you're using CO2, and once you see the pearling, you know that the pearling is happening because your aquarium water for that temperature is saturated full of oxygen. So it starts pearling. Now you know they're working. Now they're going to take some of that energy, and if there's a nitrate or phosphate in the aquarium, they will use it, because it takes a lot of energy to convert nitrate back into ammonia, which is what they use. So that's why they were showing that tank with no nitrates and no phosphates, because those plants were working very efficiently. And the other aquarium without the CO2, even though it had the light, even though the fish load was the same, as you notice, the nitrates weren't being used and the phosphates weren't being used, because the plants are struggling to grow and everything, and they're going to take what is easier. And plants will use ammonia way before they're going to use nitrates. And if they're struggling, they're not even going to touch nitrates until ammonia is just about depleted and gone.
Well, they use like bind ammonia. Like if you use one of those, like the water treatments that kind of bind the ammonia up. Will the plants use those too?
Right. That's why there was a misconception back in the 40s and 50s where they made fertilizer tablets out of nitrogen, but that's nitrogen that you would be using for terrestrial plants.
Mm-hmm.
And they would then put it to the aquatic plants, and they would bury it right by the root system. Now, yes, plants will grow real good, even in ponds and stuff like that, if you give them the nitrogen tablets and shove it in where the water lily is. But that was something that people realized using the Anoxic filtration system, how well their plants did without using fertilizer tablets. Because think about it, ponds have a lot of ammonia. You got a lot of koi, you got a lot of fish food you're feeding them. My 12 koi in a season, because you're governed by how warm the temperature is going to be. They need 50 to 60 pounds of food in that small season. And when I had 17 koi, that went up to 70 to 80 pounds in a season. That's a lot of food.
Yeah.
You're feeding in a few months. So you need a filter that could handle that. You know what I mean? So sure. These are what my Anoxic filter handled it. But 50 to 60 pounds of food for 12 koi, so that's a lot of food. And you don't start feeding them until about March. And October you stop, because in Chicagoland area by October, the weather's starting to get a little too cold, dropping down in the 40s. Now your pond's going to hit 50 or below. Forget about feeding your fish at 50 or below, because you're just going to mess them up. So you don't have a long time to feed your fish to go through 50 to 60 pounds of food every year. But koi eat a lot of food. And if you want them to grow, you got to feed them. So
sounds logical.
Right. That's a lot of food.
My next project is going to be to build some of these baskets, and I'm going to attempt to build probably the smallest. of the baskets you've ever seen, because that's what I like, are small things.
Uh-huh.
But I've got a number of these tanks with these back chambers, and I know you can't see me right now, or I'd point out some things. And you even mentioned like the aqua clear, like the fluval things. I've got a number of those. So if I took the foam and I took the biological stuff and I would just put it aside, I could probably make a little basket and put it in one of those.
But just make sure you have a pre-filter,
Right.
right? You're going to have some, like me, a canister filter. I remember I showed, I do have a pre-filter, so it still acts mechanically,
Right.
but now it's acting biologically. So you still have to have a pre-filter, okay? You don't want all that dirt and everything, collected on the basket. So still have a pre-filter, but you don't have to get it down to the 5-micron level. So
Sure.
yeah, so try it out, because I can't really tell you how small you can go,
Right.
because a lot of this stuff has got to be handmade. If you're going to make a basket, you're going to have to hand make it or something, because it's not being sold to the public. And
I've been looking for tiny canisters or tiny little containers and stuff that I can drill out and put lots of
I did
holes
the
in.
same thing. Finally, I gave up and thought, I'll buy that mesh, because I can sew it with monofilament line, and it came out real good. I got to admit, it came out perfect, because I've used it before. So I figured, you know what, I'm going to have to make my own, because this is a custom-made size. So I'm going to also set up another tank, a bigger tank. I'll have a bigger filter. I'll have a bigger everything in it, bigger PCB in it. And I'll ask the people who watch, should I put a substrate in it or leave it just without a substrate? And we'll see how it works either way. We'll see what people want. If people
Right.
say, no, do it without a substrate, just a canister, let's see how it works out. Okay, I'll do it, and I'll test it for them and let them see how it's working without any kind of substrate or anything. And I was thinking about using it, I'm going to put out in Lanai, put goldfish in there. Goldfish are very heavy bodied fish. They eat a lot. So I was thinking about doing a fish like that.
So you, if you folks at home don't know, Dr. Novak has his own YouTube channel. I am going to provide a link both in the description and one of the little circle icons at the end of the video.
I also have a blog. Basically, my blog, you don't have to even get the book. If you
Right.
click on my blog, I sent you that. It has basically everything the book has,
Okay.
and a lot of stuff that people can read. There's Sid Makisaki, I think is how he goes by. He's written articles all on the Anoxic filter, which are really interesting reading. He brings it down a few notches so everybody can understand what he's talking about. And some of my stuff, it gets a little technical. You may get a little glassy eye. It may turn you off. But in his writing, he uses words, because he's a professional writer, that everybody can understand.
A little bit more
And-
approachable, maybe.
That's right. So everybody from beginner to most advanced can read his writing. And I have that, and there are links for people can go to that and actually read about how the basket works, what they do. And if you read him, you're basically going to get a good book full of knowledge from him, Sid. And Sid and I met the same way. He's in the United Kingdom. I'm in the United States. We met just like you and I are meeting,
Mhm.
and we became good friends that way.
And this is all on the blog.
Right.
You can find his work and your work there.
Right.
We're going to link that up.
I sent you that email,
Yes.
the blog.
Yeah, I'll include a link to that in the description, so you can learn as much as you want about about this very fascinating subject, and something I had not heard about at all. I mean, it was a real eye opener this year, and it's been really fascinating kind of rabbit hole to go down. And I'm excited to experiment with a number of different tanks here.
Well, I'm glad you are. I think people need to come to the 21st century.
Mhm.
Now we got to start thinking the way natural systems run. And that's the anoxic filter. It's more of a natural system the way it works. People need to come into the 21st century. They need to get rid of all those misconceptions that they've been taught through the years. And it takes a lot, I know, because there's a lot of people who refuse. It's right. It reminds you of the CD and the record.
Mhm.
You know, people are going to diss the CD. People with CDs are going to diss records. You know, why don't you come to CDs? And now they stream music. So get rid of the CD and the record altogether. But people won't give up the record. You know?
Right. Well, there's it's funny. There's a lot of ways to approach these things, but some are just more optimal than others. And
Right.
so like I've had a great deal of success, but it's been sporadic. You know, with just putting my substrate right on the bottom and not using those types of filters and stuff. But it's always, I think it's extremely important as a hobbyist to try new things, try other things. There's always a better way. There's always another way. And a lot of people have different approaches.
Right.
And so it was refreshing to come across you and learn something new that I haven't tried or heard before.
Right.
This hobby's been around for thousands of years, and so at times it feels like there's nothing new to learn. So I really appreciate you taking the time to make videos and write this stuff down and figure it out. So maybe a whole new generation of people can learn another way to do this thing and make the hobby a little bit more accessible to everyone.
That's the key. That's the key thing is you and I going on YouTube, give the correct information so people will be the most successful as they can, right? You're not going to please everybody, but we're just trying to get the correct information. And me, because I'm a scientist, I try to give people the science behind it. I just don't tell you to do it. I tell you the science behind why you are doing it. Whether you accept it or don't accept it is up to you. But that's how I differ from probably other YouTubes. I try to give the science behind everything. Why do we do it this way?
So few of us on YouTube are scientists. I mean, most of us.
And you're not going to find.
We're mostly narcissists that like to show our aquariums.
They don't bother with you. People like me don't bother with the hobbyists.
Right.
I'm being honest with you. I even had people ask me, "Why are you wasting your time?" Really? They just look at you like, "Why are you wasting your time with those people?" They got their way of doing something. I said, "Because I'm trying. I'm trying to make a difference. That's all. That's all I can do. Just try."
Who wants to get on the internet and argue with random people all the time?
and that's terrible. You don't want to argue with people, but
sure.
None of us do.
But that's an inevitable result, I think, of especially presenting new things, new ideas about doing things as you run across that. But you're not just a guy with a crazy idea. You're an ichthyologist.
Right.
In fact, you're a Ph.D.
Right.
But tell me about your background just a little bit.
Well, I have a Ph.D. in ichthyology, which, as we all know, is the scientific study of fish. Mm-hmm. Then I have a master's in aquatic microbiology and a master's in limnology, which is freshwater systems. So that's how I came about doing all this, because I just kept going to school. But I was an aerospace mechanical engineer. That's what put me through school. Mm-hmm. And the reason I never, though I taught and stuff like this after work and stuff like that, college level and stuff like that, the reason I never got deeply involved in it, because as an engineer, I made good money. and there was no reason to leave good money after less money.
Right.
You know, because after you get so old and you do so much schooling and stuff like this, you realize, hey, I got to retire someday, right? You start thinking that, hey, I got to start getting some funds up. I want to retire. So I couldn't take a cut in pay and stuff like that. And believe me, this is, some of these jobs, they don't pay very well. And I really feel sorry for the people. But, you know, you got to think, you got to put food on the table, right? Got to send your kids through college. You got to buy a house. You got to go where the money is. And that's what I did. I went where the money is, but I used my knowledge in other ways to make money also. But my love would have been to like work for the Shed Aquarium or something. But, you know, that job, not very high paying, and only a few people are going to get big money if you're working. But to me, I just say it's politics. Okay.
And everything you've done with this filtration and the examples that you've shown and the help that you've given us on the internet, it's all free. You haven't asked for any money for any of that.
No, I even told people that. As you notice, I never ask people to subscribe. If you want to subscribe, fine. If you don't, okay. I haven't made a dime from YouTube off of this. I gave everything away free, all the knowledge away free to people. Never made any money off of this. No, not a penny. This is something I found out that's great. Give it to people, you know, but it's been a hard road because I am not a corporation. I'm not a big company. I'm not Tetra. I'm not Fluvo. So I'm just a little guy. And the little guy, you know, he doesn't advertise. I can't do the advertising like the big guy can. I can't convince you with slick ads or anything in magazines or anything. I can't do any of that. I'm just a little guy. So I gave it for free.
Well, Dr. Novak, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for joining the video today. It was a long video, but I thought it was really fascinating. I couldn't bring myself to really cut much of it. I had intended to cut it down for time, but there wasn't any good parts to cut out. It was all good, valid information. I'd really like to have Dr. Novak on again. If you have any specific questions for him, feel free to leave it in the comments down below, and maybe in a couple of weeks, we'll have him back on and we'll ask him some of those questions. I'd also like to know if there are other people that you would like to see interviewed. I've got a lot of YouTube friends, and I'm thinking about bringing some of them on to do something similar. So if you like that, if you felt like this was really interesting, give me that thumbs up and a comment and let me know. So I'll be back next week with another video, and hopefully I'll be able to have time to whip together some tiny BCB baskets like we talked about in this video. It'd be really interesting to kind of get that in play and see how they work. But until we meet again, follow your bliss, keep a clean tank, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.